Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about the doctrine of double effect. And look, I know that the Wallachau reading on natural law theory did not mention double effect really, or I think he mentioned it in passing, but he didn't say much about it. And as much as I like the reading in some respects, that's really a shame because double effect is important. It's important for natural law theory. It's also important more generally. It is applied outside of natural law theory. Um, some of the ethics of how people think about physician assisted suicide, or at least some people, really depend on this doctrine of double effect. Just war theory, I'm not going to get deeply into it, but just war theory, the laws of war really make reference to this doctrine of double effect. So the piece from the BBC I pointed you guys towards hopefully gave you a basic idea of what double effect is. But in this lecture, I want to go into a lot more detail. Say what double effect is, why it's so important to natural law theory. Okay, so I think to understand why double effect is important to natural law theory, it's important to note that natural law theory is very strict. It is uncompromising in what it says. Natural law theory will say you cannot act in a way that fails to show respect for the intrinsic goods, human life, human sociability, knowledge, procreation. You can't act in a way that fails to show respect for them, no matter what. Well, that seems pretty unrealistic in some cases. That seems impossible in some cases. That seems bad in some cases, right? Imagine that someone is going to kill you unless you kill them first. They go back to my axe murderer. Well, doesn't it seem that anything you do in a situation like that fails to show respect for human life? If you let him axe murder you, that doesn't respect your own life. If you kill him, doesn't that fail to show respect for his life? Or imagine another case, right? Imagine, you know, um, a war. If you let some awful side that plans on committing genocide win, well, that fails to show respect for human life. On the other hand, if you fight them, you're going to have to kill some people, right? Well, how do we deal with this? Well, double effect was really formulated within the idea of self-defense or war, but it has applications elsewhere. And so double effect will say we're allowed to do some things. It was originally formulated, we're allowed to kill in certain circumstances if certain conditions are satisfied. There will be other situations where double effect will be important. Ending a life will be the most important. So what does double effect say? Well, as the BBC piece I had you guys read says, what double effect says is you can do an action that has a bad or otherwise forbidden result. It kills another human being, or it fails to show respect for sociability in some way, or knowledge, or whatever, procreation, if the bad effect is unintended. The example the BBC piece gives, well, natural law theory would say it's wrong to deliberately kill someone, right? You cannot kill a patient even if he has a terminal illness and that will ease his pain. But let's say you give him a dose of morphine that you know might kill him or maybe even will kill him, but your intention is not to kill him. Your intention is to ease his pain. Natural law theory may very well allow that. because what you intend to do, easing his pain, is not a bad thing, even though it has a foreseeable and unavoidable bad effect, killing this person. Now, we'll talk more about that in a second, but I want to go more deeply into the conditions on double effect. The BBC piece doesn't really talk about these. I think these are important. So, for double effect to apply, for it to allow an action in traditional natural law theory, 4 conditions must be satisfied. The action must be intrinsically permissible, it must be necessary, it must be non-intentional. We've talked about the non-intentional already, and it must be proportional. Well, what do these mean? Well, I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then I think it'll make more sense to apply these to actual cases. It'll make more sense of what they mean. Intrinsically permissible, though, means the action itself must be something that is normally allowed. The morphine case, it's normally allowed to give someone a dose of morphine to ease their pain. In this case, it just so happens that a dose high enough might actually kill the person, but the thing you're doing, giving the person a dose of morphine to ease their pain, is intrinsically permissible. For double effect to allow it, it has to be necessary. In this case, no dose of morphine that doesn't pose a danger to the person's life would actually ease their pain. If a lower dose or some other painkiller would work, you can't do it because it's not necessary. Non-intentional. Again, we put a lot of weight on this. Your intention can't be the bad thing, killing in this case. It has to be the good thing, easing the pain. Proportional. Once you get down the list of proportionality, proportionality basically works like consequentialism. The good effect has to be greater than the bad. In the morphine case, easing someone who's dying's terrible suffering, maybe you shorten their life by a day or two, but it would be a day of terrible suffering. The good you do, easing their pain, much greater than the bad of depriving them of a couple days of life that wouldn't even have very high quality of life. Proportionality is basically a utilitarian condition. Once you get this far, then you start applying utilitarian criteria, but the other 3 conditions aren't, and all 4 of these have to be satisfied. Before proportionality even comes into it, 1 through 3 has to be satisfied. Okay, so I know this might be a little unclear to you guys. Let's just talk through how this is going to work with a few more examples. So let's contrast an operation to remove a tumor that threatens a pregnant woman's life with abortion. So natural law theory, let's say a woman had a really aggressive, fast-growing tumor, and the only way to save her life is to remove it now. But it just so happens that removing it, she's pregnant, it will kill the fetus. Natural law theory would allow this. Why? Well, an operation to remove a tumor is a thing that is intrinsically permissible. If she wasn't pregnant, we could do this no problem for natural law theory. It is also, at least in the way I've set the case up, necessary, right? If we wait, the tumor will grow, it will spread, it will kill her. If it wasn't necessary, if it was slow growing, if you could wait and remove it, natural law theory would say you have to do that. It is also, hopefully at least, non-intentional, right? The doctor doing this does not want to kill the fetus. He wants to save the woman's life, or she wants to save the woman's life. It just so happens to do that, you have to do this thing that will result in the death of the fetus. Finally, it's proportional. The good you're doing, you're saving a life. Yes, you will end a life, but you are also saving one. You don't do more evil than the good you do. If you want to make this really non-problematic on proportionality, you could imagine that the tumor will itself kill the fetus, threaten its life in some way, right? Now, contrast this, at least for natural law theory, with abortion. For natural law theory, abortion fails to show respect for human life. Abortion is not intrinsically permissible in the way that removing a tumor is. So for natural law theory, there would be a huge difference between the tumor case and a case where, a woman's life is threatened by carrying a fetus to term, and the doctor performs an abortion to save her life. Abortion for natural law theory is not intrinsically permissible. Or contrast the morphine case with physician-assisted suicide. Giving someone a dose of morphine to ease their pain is intrinsically permissible. Killing an innocent person, innocent for natural law theory, meaning non-threatening, is not. Dose of morphine that might result in the person's death is permissible. Giving them a drug with the express intent and purpose of killing them is not. Or think about military operations. Think about self-defense generally before we even get the idea of military operations, right? Aquinas will say that self-defense is allowed because your intention is not to kill the other person. Your intention is to save your own life. Saving your own life is intrinsically permissible. It just so happens to do it in this case. You have to kill the other person. The force you have to use to stop them from killing you will result in their death. Or another way you can think of this, it's permissible to stop a genocide. It just so happens that to do it, you'll have to wage war, which will end up with people dying. Or think of another military case, and this applies to the ethics of war. This is one way that the doctrine of double effect, natural law theory, has actually influenced our thinking. In a military operation against a valid target, say a plant that's making bombs, well, if your intention as a military planner is to blow up that plant, that's permissible. It is a valid target. It is permissible in war to destroy something that's making weapons. But let's imagine that the other side has built the factory in the middle of a civilian neighborhood because they think that, well, that'll stop us from bombing it. Well, natural law theory would say, in this case, it's permissible to bomb this factory even though it will foreseeably result in civilian deaths. Why? Well, because that's not your intention. Your intention is to destroy the bomb factory, right? In war, attacking a bomb factory is intrinsically permissible. Maybe it's necessary to stop them producing these bombs. The bad effect, killing civilians, is foreseeable, it's unintended, and we can imagine it's proportional. It's important enough for the war effort that we have to destroy this factory. Natural law theory would insist there's a difference between that, blowing up this bomb factory, even though doing it so might kill the civilians who live next to it. There's a difference between that and deliberately targeting civilians, right? we might deliberately target civilians because we know the other country will have to spend effort defending their people. Well, natural law theory would say that's wrong. It is not intrinsically permissible to kill civilians, to deliberately target them. You can do things that result in their deaths. You can't deliberately target them. And this is an aspect of natural law theory that's actually been preserved in the way we think about war. The rules of war that have been, put in the Geneva Conventions and international treaties draw a big distinction between militarily legitimate things that will result in civilians' deaths versus deliberately targeting them. Okay, so hopefully this idea of the doctrine of double effect makes sense to you guys. Goes back to this idea that the intention matters for natural law theory. Now look, I am going to guess that y'all, many of you at least, might be pushing back on this idea of double effect, right? You might be saying, well, what's the difference between foreseeing that something will happen and intending it? If I foresee that something will result in your death, how's that different than intending your death, right? Is it just that I feel bad about it, that I don't want to do it? It seems like we can intend to do things even if we might not like doing them, right? I might feel guilty about something I intend to do and still intend to do it, right? How is there a real difference here? The doctor who performs an abortion to save a woman's life might feel vaguely guilty about it, but natural law theory would insist that he still intends to do it. Well, what is to do something and foresee it but not intend it? I don't know. I have a suspicion here that natural law theory is slicing things pretty thin. I am not sure how defensible this distinction is, but it is important for natural law theory, and it's even important for the way we think about the ethics of war. So if you're skeptical about it, I share your suspicion, and we will talk about that in the last series of slides, but hopefully you at least understand the distinction, understand what's going on.